Tonight, I'll share chilling accounts of families plagued by strange and unsettling phenomena. Stories taken straight from the files of the Pentagon, no less. Witnesses describe terrifying apparitions, shadowy figures, and even wolf-like creatures standing on hind legs, staring into their homes. And what is striking is that in all of these cases, even though they happen in multiple locations, they all share a common thread. One person in each place had visited Skinwalker Ranch in Utah. Now, I know Skinwalker Ranch has been talked about in many ways, and you may be aware of it already. I'm sure you are. It's sometimes described as a paranormal Disneyland, infamous for strange lights in the sky, bizarre creatures, and all sorts of things. However, not everyone seems to talk about what happens after people leave the ranch, because it leads to a chilling phenomenon that is really important to explore. How people can go home and yet can bring with them disturbing and sometimes life-altering phenomena. Researchers call this the Hitchhiker Effect, where paranormal activity doesn't stay confined to one place but attaches itself to people. Might this theory explain why haunted houses and poltergeist cases seem to escalate or spread? There is a researcher called Darren Ritson who uses a different phrase for this. He calls it paranormal contagion, suggesting that in some cases supernatural events almost appear to infect victims like a contagious disease. The idea challenges everything we think we know about hauntings, suggesting that the phenomena at places like Skinwalker Ranch may not be an isolated case, but part of a much larger pattern that demands deeper exploration. The cases you'll hear blur the lines between classic hauntings and something far more mysterious. Is it a poltergeist that follows them home, a ghost, a demon, or perhaps something beyond what we have ever imagined? And before we carry on, I better mention that the last time I spoke about this topic for an audio podcast, a surprising number of listeners got in touch to say weird things happened in their house after listening to it. Now, I'm not going to say that that's going to happen to you, but when I share the experiences that some people have had at the end of this episode, I'd hate for you to get upset and say, you should have mentioned this earlier, I wouldn't have watched it. So if you're worried about paranormal contagion being connected to just talking about these topics, then I won't be offended if you step out of this one early. But if you want to stick around and stay with me, then I'm Peter Laws. And tonight we go into the fog and we meet the wolves that follow you home and the Hitchhiker Effect of Skinwalker Ranch. Skinwalker Ranch spans 500 acres in northern Utah. Various paranormal activity has been cited at that place, from lights in the sky, UFOs, UAPs, Sasquatch sightings, psychic activity, cattle mutilations, and encounters with frightening wolf-like creatures. The activity has been so persistent that both private investors and the US government have invested heavily in trying to uncover the truth of that place. The Navajo and the Ute tribes once lived in the region, and according to Navajo law, a skinwalker is a witch capable of transforming into an animal or human. The term skinwalker roughly translates to "it goes on all fours." Even as early as 1906, local newspapers were documenting peculiar events in the area. From the 40s into the 60s, there were reports of UFO sightings and encounters with so-called skinwalkers, part human, part wolf. The ranch gained widespread attention, however, in the 90s, when the Sherman family moved in and began experiencing terrifying, unexplainable events. One day, Terry and Gwen Sherman saw a strange wolf-like figure near the livestock pen. It attacked a calf. It clamped its jaws on the animal. Terry fired at it with a handgun, then a rifle, but the creature seemed unaffected and wandered into the bushes. Over the following months, more sightings of strange animals or creatures occurred, witnessed not only by the Shermans but also by visitors to the ranch. Roars and howls echoed through the land at night. The family also began discovering cattle mutilated in grotesque ways. And so by 1996, after enduring 2 years of bizarre events, the Sherman family decided they'd had enough and they sold the ranch to a billionaire called Robert Bigelow. He bought it and asked Terry Sherman to stay on as caretaker. Bigelow wasted no time setting up the National Institute for Discovery Science, that's called NIDS for short, and they investigated the strange phenomena there. NIDS documented chilling events, mysterious lights, eerie, disembodied voices, and cattle mutilations in broad daylight. Fast forward to 2016, and the ranch changed hands again and was sold to a real estate magnate called Brandon Fugal. Initially keeping his ownership secret, Fugal revealed himself in 2020 with the launch of The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch, a History Channel series documenting ongoing research into the site's mysteries. Perhaps you've seen it. It's presented as reality TV, but the investigations appear to many to involve genuine scientific efforts. But while the show examines what happens on the ranch primarily, tonight we will focus on something far more unnerving in some ways, because it could affect all of us. It's what happens after people leave. The idea that this stuff could spill out into the rest of the world. And we call it the Hitchhiker Effect. In September 2008, a secret government program was launched by the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA. It was called AWSAP, the Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Applications Program. Its mission was to investigate how UFOs and UAPs, that's unidentified aerial phenomena, might affect humans. The public knew nothing about this $22 million project until the New York Times exposed it nearly a decade later in 2017. AWSAP, over the years, had assembled a team of 50 experts, scientists, engineers, analysts, and technicians, tasked with exploring the physiological and psychological effects of UFO encounters. And one of their primary research sites was Skinwalker Ranch in Utah. Not long after the program began, 5 military personnel were sent to the ranch, and remarkably, all 5 of them reported strange, unexplained phenomena during their visit. But what's even more disturbing is what happened later. You see, all 5 claimed that the paranormal activity didn't stay on the ranch. It followed them home. These chilling accounts are documented in the 2021 book Skinwalkers at the Pentagon by DIA analyst James T. Lukatsky, biochemist Colm Kelleher, and investigative journalist George Knapp. And what they describe goes beyond strange lights in the sky or eerie noises. Some of the events that follow these individuals' homes are genuinely terrifying and have really weirdly prescient links to haunted house cases. So let's look together at one such frightening example. Among those 5 military personnel was a high-ranking naval intelligence officer. He was an accomplished engineer who would later attain the rank of a 2-star admiral with top-secret clearances. For the purposes of the report, he was given the pseudonym Jonathan Axelrod. In July 2009, Axelrod visited the ranch, accompanied by 2 other officials with expertise in sensor technology. During their stay, the trio encountered disturbing paranormal activity. It happened one warm summer evening as the men were hiking across the ranch. They suddenly stopped walking when all 3 noticed that the temperature around them had just plummeted by around 20 degrees. Cold spots are a common feature of haunted house cases. You could almost call them cliché. But here they were, walking into a bizarre spot of cold outside on a warm ranch. Intrigued, Axelrod motioned for the group to step backwards from this cold spot. Everyone did, and as they did, the temperature immediately returned to normal. But stepping forward again plunged them back into that same icy pocket of space. They were confused, of course, but determined to continue. And so they pressed on, and they equipped their night vision goggles. Yet as they walked, an intense and growing sense of unease began to overtake the men. None of them initially admitted it at first, but there was an anxiety growing in them. An anxiety that grew into actual terror. Finally, Axelrod broke the silence, asking, "Do you guys feel that?" The others confessed that they were experiencing an overpowering fear, a kind of mortal dread, unlike anything they had felt before. Now, bear in mind, these were seasoned military operatives, accustomed to high-stakes missions, so they didn't scare easily, and yet here they were feeling a sense of imminent threat and dread, even though nothing visible had changed. Well, they soon would see something, because suddenly one of the men, a man called Costigan, whispered, "Wait, look," and he gestured towards the west. The group turned to see the faint silhouette of Homestead 2. That's a cluster of buildings about 50 yards away from them. It's well known as a particularly strong source of activity on the ranch. But Costigan wasn't pointing at the buildings as such. He was fixated on an eerie shape that was becoming visible through his night vision goggles. In the distinctive green hue of night vision, Costigan saw a strange dark oval shape ahead of them on the track. This oval, about 8 feet tall, appeared as a void where no light registered, a black hole in the otherwise illuminated scene. Interestingly, I've heard multiple witnesses of haunted house cases and buildings saying that they see apparitions of figures that seem like a black void, as if all light in that area was missing. Well, Costigan was the only one to see the shape, but all three men continued to feel that instinctive and overwhelming fear. Costigan was convinced that the ominous oval that he was looking at, whatever it was the source of this dread. And in their report, the men did say that they felt so intimidated by this anomaly that they believed approaching it any closer could result in their death. Deciding not to risk it, they hurried back to the control center trailer. The further they moved away from this weird black mass, the more their fear subsided. Well, the following day came and they decided to retrace their steps across the property, but as they did that, they encountered no unusual phenomena. They didn't find any cold spot, no dark oval, no sense of dread, and perplexed, they returned home to their families. But if they thought the strangeness was confined to the ranch, they were mistaken, particularly Jonathan Axelrod. Jonathan returned to his family home, which was 200 miles away in Virginia. And less than a month later, shocking events began to unfold in this household. Concerned, he contacted biologist and author Colm Kelleher, and he explained that the phenomena were not targeting him directly, but rather his family when he wasn't there. You see, there had been poltergeist activity in his home. Ceiling fans and televisions were turning on and off by themselves. Books were appearing inexplicably piled at the bottom of the stairs. But Jonathan recounted a particularly unsettling incident involving his wife, Ruth. One night around 2 a.m., Ruth woke to find a large, dark figure moving towards her bed. Startled, she turned on the light, only to find the figure had gone. Now, some of you will hear that and quickly dismiss that as a trick of the light or perhaps a dream. Well, that's exactly what Ruth did too. She shrugged it off and returned back to sleep, thinking it was just all in her head. But then, 10 minutes later, she heard heavy footsteps pounding up their staircase. Now, her husband was there at the time and was still fast asleep, and Ruth decided to venture out to the landing to investigate. You see, she assumed that one of their children was up late. Yet when she got out onto the stairs and landing, the place was empty. She was confused, so she went to check on the children and found them both sound asleep in their beds. Now, Ruth wasn't alarmed enough to panic, but she was undeniably unsettled by that first sight of the figure and now this almost unmistakable pounding of footsteps on the stairs. Well, over the next month, the activity escalated significantly. During this time, Jonathan Axelrod was away on overseas military missions, and one night their 16-year-old son back home, Paul, woke to find multiple small blue orbs hovering around his room. One orb floated particularly close to him before he shouted for his mom. And when Ruth entered the room, this ball of light, this orb, whatever you want to call it, vanished. But the strange occurrences didn't stop there. Ruth began to see shadowy figures walking through the house. These figures became more and more frequent. Again, a very common sight in hauntings. She also heard loud noises coming from the kitchen at night, long after the family had gone to bed. The Axelrods couldn't help but notice that these events had all started after Jonathan had returned from that infamous Utah ranch. But their experiences just kept getting scarier. Jonathan Axelrod then told Kelleher about the most striking and terrifying event yet. It was nighttime. At the Axelrod residence, Jonathan was away on assignment again, and Ruth was heading upstairs to bed. She just switched off the kitchen lights and was about to walk up the staircase when she caught a glimpse of movement in the yard out of the corner of her eye. Nervous but curious, she moved towards the window, and what she saw there froze her to the spot. There was a figure there, standing in her backyard. But this wasn't some vague, shadowy form like she'd seen flitting around the house earlier. This thing was sharp and clear and undeniably there. And the only way she could describe this was that it was some kind of wolf-like creature with long hair. It wasn't on all fours, though. It stood tall, like a human, on its hind legs. In fact, it was leaning casually against a tree, watching her. Ruth said she was paralyzed with fear and confusion. The creature's gaze was unrelenting, and its demeanor not friendly. In fact, there was a malicious tone to its glare, a sort of greedy anger. The sense of imminent danger was unmistakable. It was similar to what her husbands and his colleagues had experienced back at the ranch, a feeling of dread. Yet she couldn't take her eyes off this thing, and it seemed to be doing the same, watching her back as if it was studying her. This all sounds shockingly similar to the 1970s experience of Dr. Anne Ross, a Celtic scholar who, along with her husband and daughter, witnessed a tall wolf-like creature in their English home. And this happened after obtaining a set of ancient stone artifacts which were found in a home plagued with poltergeist activity. For more on that fascinating case, see my video, The Horror of the Hexham Heads. So Ruth just stood there, her brain scrambling to come to terms with what was looking back at her in the night. But then, without warning, the creature broke eye contact. Then it turned and walked on its two legs into the trees surrounding the backyard. It was gone. Ruth, who had shown remarkable courage up to this point, was deeply shaken. She span on her feet and hurried upstairs to bed. She lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, trying to comprehend what had happened and what might still be out there in the darkness, watching the house again, or, God forbid, right now, walking towards to get inside and find her. Up until now, Ruth had shared all of the strange experiences of the house with her husband, but this was too much. She decided not to tell anyone. Why worry her family with something so absurd? Wolves don't stand upright and walk like humans. This has got to have been a hallucination. Yet 3 days later, Ruth received chilling confirmation that it wasn't all in her mind. 3 days had passed. It was 10:30 a.m. on a bright Saturday morning. It was hardly the time for anything supernatural, it felt. Ruth was out, and Jonathan was still away on military business. Their two sons, Paul and Michael, were in the living room. Paul, who was the same son who had those strange orbs, those lights in his room, decided to stand up to stretch his legs. When he did, he noticed movement in the backyard. He looked out of the window to check what it was, and he gasped in utter shock. You see, there in broad daylight stood a 7-foot-tall, wolf-like creature. I know how insane this sounds. I am literally just telling you what these reports say. This thing was upright on two legs, and like it did with his mother, it was staring directly at him. Michael, the brother, noticed Paul's terror-filled reaction, and he jumped up to see for himself. And both boys saw the creature clearly and later described its malevolent gaze, saying that it exuded an unmistakable sense of hostility and threat. Horrified, they watched as the creature started to move. But instead of coming towards him, it turned and moved towards the trees. This time, however, it didn't simply walk like the other night. It sprinted on its two legs as if that were a natural way of it moving. The Pentagon report notes that the boys could see its long, dark hair flowing as it raced across the yard and disappeared into the tree line. When Ruth returned some hours later, her sons were frantic, babbling to her about what they had seen. And as they described the creature, Ruth's body must have felt like it was filling with cold cement. She stood there frozen, knowing that they were describing the exact same thing she had seen 3 days earlier. The thing she had tried so hard to dismiss as her imagination. She hadn't told anyone about it yet, but now her sons had witnessed the same thing, with no prompting from her. It was time to tell Jonathan. Well, when Jonathan returned from his mission, Ruth and the boys told him everything about the creature, and understandably disturbed, Jonathan helped them to examine the area where the thing had disappeared into the trees. And when they took a closer look at that place, they found some deep, fresh-looking gashes in the tree trunks. The vertical slashes were unmistakable, evidence that something physical had been there, but what? As the family struggled to come to terms with these events, Jonathan couldn't help but reflect on his experience at Skinwalker Ranch. Before that trip, their home had never been plagued by anything like this. Now, just 2 months after his return, every member of his family had encountered something inexplicable. To make matters worse, the family began suffering from health issues. Pre-existing conditions they had, like lupus, Raynaud's disease, flared up severely, and they also experienced intense flu-like symptoms following these encounters. Were they linked? The strangers didn't stop at the Axelrod household either. You see, despite the family's efforts to keep their experiences quiet, others began reporting strange phenomena too. Get this, one of Paul's friends called him in 2011, claiming to have seen something terrifying outside of his bedroom window the previous night. Paul said, "Well, what did you see?" And he said, "You're not going to believe this, but I saw a large wolf standing on its hind legs like a human would." Almost as if these experiences were just spilling out like a flood. Weeks later, another friend of his mentioned seeing strange blue lights flying around his backyard. Jonathan Axelrod, a high-ranking officer in Naval intelligence, remember, and the leader of that military team that visited Skinwalker Ranch, firmly believed that these events were connected, and he concluded that when he and his colleagues saw that strange black shape on the ranch, something had attached itself to him and followed him home. He had experienced a contagion of the paranormal. But he wasn't the only one. In the book, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, the authors recount a private dinner in Washington, D.C. It was a dinner that brought a group of covert investigators from the US government together to discuss the paranormal. And these individuals were actively researching UFOs and UAPs. And as the conversation turned inevitably to Skinwalker Ranch, it became clear that most of the dinner guests had already visited the ranch. However, there were two attendees that hadn't. Louise Elizondo, who has since become a prominent figure in the UAP world, and a woman called Juliet Whitt. Whitt was an analyst for the Pentagon and a target census specialist. She had experience from being on multiple tours in Russia and Afghanistan. Curious about the ranch, she said she'd like to see the place for herself, and so she arranged to visit it 3 weeks later, bringing along high-tech monitoring equipment. She traveled to Utah aboard Robert Bigelow's private jet. Remember, Bigelow owned the ranch at this time. When she arrived, Whitt planned to walk the perimeter of the ranch, conducting measurements with her specialist sensor equipment. And she decided to do 2 circuits. One would be in the daytime and the other at night. So she had a quick meal at the ranch, and then she walked across the grounds. It was daylight, and she was accompanied by 2 dogs and Colm Kelleher. And as they walked, he briefed her on the many strange occurrences reported at the ranch. It must have been a fascinating, if potentially unnerving, hike for her. At one point, they came across a scattering of dead animals. Now, it was possible that these deaths were natural, but this feature was still remarkable enough to be mentioned in the report. Once that circuit was complete, she and Kelleher went back to the ranch. And then, several hours later, once the sun had set, they went back out for the second run. This time, Robert Bigelow was there, and he decided to join them for the night walk. They had the dogs with them again, too. It was around 10 or 11 p.m. when they headed towards Homestead 2. Remember that there's a collection of old buildings on the ranch where anomalies are frequently reported. Also where Axelrod and his group had seen the strange black figure. Well, the moonlight illuminated their path as they reached a small pasture near to Homestead 2. They set up 3 folding chairs in a back-to-back formation to give them a 360-degree view of the area. And then they waited. At first, everything was quiet. The 3 watched the ranch while the dogs padded around nearby. But over time, Kelleher noticed that Whitt seemed increasingly agitated. Her breathing grew quick and unsteady, an unexpected reaction from someone with her extensive military experience. Yet it was weirdly similar to Axelrod's reaction to the place. After an hour, Kelleher and Bigelow decided to explore the perimeter, and Whitt was not happy with this plan because she refused to be left alone monitoring this part. She didn't want to be alone on this ranch at all, and so she insisted on joining them. And as they walked, something extraordinary occurred. The usual sounds of the night abruptly stopped, as if the world had been suddenly muted. Again, this is a feature of other supernatural cases, like the one I discovered from the 17th century called Trapped in the Woods, which I shared in another video. And this happened here. They stood in a weird dark silence for a while, and then they saw a strange creature resembling a pig with spines along its back and some sort of bizarre tail. It shuffled past them, and they instinctively gave chase, but the creature disappeared into the darkness. Shaken and confused, they returned to headquarters, no doubt throwing out theories of what the heck they had just experienced. And they finally settled in for the night. The next morning, calm Kelleher was given a little bit of information about Juliet Whitt, which surprised him. It turned out that last night had not been an easy one for her, because she had specially requested a security officer to sleep on a couch outside of her room all night. She had insisted on leaving her bedroom door wide open and keeping the living room lights fully on. Clearly, her experiences on the ranch had unsettled her. Well, with the light of day coming, the very welcome thought of home came too, and so Whitt got ready to leave the ranch. But she appeared to be returning to her usual confident and enthusiastic self. She even admitted to Kelleher that before she left, she had taken some heather and sage from the ranch as mementos of her visit. But her time at the ranch wasn't over. You see, a few weeks passed when Whitt began reporting unsettling activity in her Virginia townhouse. She had a roommate who woke up one night screaming. He claimed that a figure had been leaning over his bed. When Whitt rushed in and turned on the lights, there was no one there. This is a very similar experience to Axelrod's wife, Ruth. Whitt's household also began experiencing poltergeist-like activity, like the Axelrods did. Loud banging noises came from the kitchen and heavy footsteps on the stairs. Her roommate grew increasingly terrified as the activity continued. And then Whitt experienced something even more bizarre. One day, she was in a car backing out of the driveway when a gigantic bird swooped down and attacked the car. She described it as a kind of owl, but it was much larger than any she'd ever seen. And Whitt had no idea at the time that overt aggression in birds and owls has indeed been featured in some modern UFO cases, for example, in eyewitness accounts. But whatever the case, this bird's aggression was absolutely unprecedented, and it left visible scrapes and gouges on the car's metal and paintwork. Was this just a random coincidence? Maybe. But there did seem to be echoes with the Axelrod family, who found the claw marks on the tree of their home. As time went on, the poltergeist activity in her home intensified and became more distressing. For example, one evening, Whitt and her roommate were sitting in the living room when 2 wine bottles flew off the rack and smashed against the wall with violent force. And this incident was the final straw for the roommate. He promptly moved out, unable to endure any more supernatural disturbances. And yet, even as he left, the activity persisted. Just like Ruth Axelrod had witnessed, Whitt began seeing shadowy figures in her bedroom, and she insisted that none of this had happened before her visit to Skinwalker Ranch. Astonishingly, the poltergeist-like phenomena lingered for years after her return from the ranch. Is it possible that both Whitt and Axelrod had somehow picked up a kind of paranormal contagion that they had passed on to their own homes? It's a fascinating theory, but it gets even more bizarre than that. You see, the Pentagon reports even claim that the Hitchhiker Effect seemed to spread not just in a visit to the ranch, but even by simply talking about it. Something perhaps you might bear in mind if you want to risk still listening to this. You see, on February the 7th, 2011, James Lakatsky, the senior analyst for the Defense Intelligence Agency, attended an extraordinary meeting at the Department of Homeland Security in Washington, D.C. The purpose of the meeting was to brief two government officials, Jim Bell and Sasha Mover. They were talking about the paranormal phenomena associated with Skinwalker Ranch, as well as the work of the AWSAP program in general. Originally planned as a 1-hour briefing, there was so much to talk about. This meeting stretched into 3.5 hours, a session where Lakatsky delved into the bizarre and unsettling events that had been logged under the AWSAP program. He shared details of UAPs, poltergeists, strange activities, and much more. Both Bell and Mover were fascinated and deeply unsettled by what they heard. Reportedly, they experienced sleepless nights after this. But what makes this meeting particularly eerie is what occurred on that same night, not to Lakatsky or Bell or Mover, but in two separate locations connected to Skinwalker Ranch. You see, that very night, 60 miles away in Virginia, strange events began unfolding in the Axelrod family home. Jonathan Axelrod's teenage sons had just gone to bed, but one of them, Paul, who we mentioned earlier, struggled to sleep. The next morning, February the 8th, Ruth Axelrod found it difficult to wake Paul, who was unusually exhausted and irritable that morning. When he finally sat up, Ruth was alarmed to see strange red welts on his cheeks and similar bruises on his torso. They resembled marks left by blows from physical contact. When questioned, Paul recounted a terrifying experience which he said had kept him up all night. He had fallen asleep quickly, but he was woken in the night by a bright light filling his room. And he saw two blue lights or orbs drifting near him, casting light as they moved. And these lights came and touched him and caused him pain. Shortly afterwards, he saw two red lights, which seemed more aggressive, that dived at him. Paul was terrified and he hid under the covers, but the horror didn't stop. He also saw two shadowy figures in his room, which he described as screaming in agony, like they were in extreme pain or being tortured. Fascinating part is that he didn't hear the screams in his ears, but in his mind. You see, this detail is noteworthy because Paul is partially deaf. When asked why he didn't call for help, Paul explained that he tried to cry out for his mom, but no sound would come out of his mouth. It sounds like something from a nightmare. Despite his fear, the encounter left visible physical marks, proof that something beyond a nightmare had happened, but what? And it's worth remembering that these ideas of lights flying around might sound like something from a science fiction movie or just a UFO type idea, but there is plenty of haunted house cases and poltergeist cases where witnesses say they see weird lights moving around the house. Well, this experience left Paul feeling nauseous, feverish, and drained, forced him to stay home from school that day, and over the next 2 weeks he was interviewed by phone and in person by a physician about his ordeal. But meanwhile, on the same night as that 3-hour meeting in Washington, and the same night Paul faced those lights and figures in his bedroom, strange events were occurring back at Skinwalker Ranch, specifically at Homestead 2 again. The rancher's dogs had been acting unusually skittish for days, refusing to leave their kennels. 2 guards patrolling the property also reported a foreboding sense of impending doom. Well, that evening, one of the guards, a man called Idiohorst, approached Homestead 2. And as he entered one of the dilapidated buildings, he was overwhelmed by a deep, oppressive sense of presence. He set his flashlight on the nearby shelf and switched it off, stood in the darkness, convinced he wasn't alone. And in an attempt to confront whatever it was, Idiohorst called out, "Show yourself." Within seconds, the flashlight on the shelf flicked on, blinding him momentarily before shutting off again. Gathering his courage, he repeated, "Show yourself." The flashlight responded once more, turning on and off as if in acknowledgement. Idiohorst was stunned, trying to determine whether he was communicating with something unseen. But then the oppressive atmosphere just became unbearable, and so the guard grabbed his flashlight and bolted out of that building. He made it back to the ranch headquarters, managing to calm himself, though he was left with a pounding headache and a sense of exhaustion. he shared his experience with a colleague before heading to bed, hoping sleep would relieve his discomfort. However, like Paul in Virginia, he endured a restless, nightmare-filled night, and in his dreams he found himself back at Homestead 2. When he woke the next morning, February the 8th, he felt utterly drained and physically battered, as though he had been through an ordeal in the night, just as Paul was feeling in Virginia at the same time. The researchers were so intrigued when they learned of his experience, because they compared his account with Paul's in Virginia, and it raised questions about whether, as wild as it sounds, whether these incidents could be connected to Lakatsky's meeting at the Department of Homeland Security. The events of February the 7th, 2011 have made some believe that paranormal phenomena like that seen at Skinwalker Ranch is simply way weirder and far-reaching than we ever thought. Could it be that the Hitchhiker Effect can transcend physical boundaries, impacting individuals far from the ranch itself? You know, there just isn't enough time to delve into every person who claims to have had an experience of the Hitchhiker Effect at Skinwalker Ranch, but I am going to tell you just a few cases that stand out before we start wrapping things up. The man who established the NIDS program, Robert Bigelow, he reported experiencing strange anomalies in his home after visiting the ranch. In fact, Bigelow partially attributed the Hitchhiker Effect to his decision to sell the ranch in 2016. In a 2021 interview with George Knapp, Bigelow said this:
I was very disturbed towards the end because of something that happened to some of the government people. Everybody took things home with them. I took things to my house. Things happened to my wife and to me. Everybody took things home. We all did, but we didn't know it was going to be kind of permanent. We didn't know that this was going to stay with you for maybe years and years of the rest of your life. Who knows? And it's not that it happened on the ranch. It's when they left the ranch. I do say hitchhikers. And these are government people, and it affected them in very dramatic ways. Very dramatic ways.
Astrophysicist Dr. Travis Taylor, a core member of the current research team at the ranch, stated that Bigelow even attributed his wife's death in 2020 to the exposure at the ranch. She died of myeloid dysplastic syndrome and acute myeloid leukemia 4 years after the ranch was sold. Investigative journalist George Knapp, co-author of Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, visited the ranch multiple times, including overnight stays. Afterwards, his wife reported seeing multiple apparitions in their Las Vegas home, and they both witnessed strange blue orbs floating outside their windows. Can you remember Costigan, Jim Costigan? He was the one who accompanied Jonathan Axelrod and David Wilson to the ranch in July 2009. He had his own disturbing experiences. After encountering the cold spot and witnessing the black oval anomaly through night vision goggles, Costigan returned to his family home in Maryland. In September 2009, his wife reported seeing a blue light floating around their house. She said it grazed her arm. Soon after, she fell ill and was diagnosed with Hashimoto's thyroiditis. It's an autoimmune disease where the immune system attacks the thyroid gland. Biochemist and author Colm Kelleher, along with George Knapp, interviewed 10 security personnel who had worked on the ranch. Some had been there for as little as 2 weeks, yet every one of them reported experiencing poltergeist activity in their houses after they left the ranch. Dr. Travis Taylor revealed that many of his colleagues had since begun setting up measuring equipment in their own homes, as the Hitchhiker Effect had become so frequent. Some researchers have grown superstitious, avoiding discussions about the phenomena for fear of inviting it into their lives. So what is exactly happening both on and off Skinwalker Ranch? In April 2022, Dr. Jim Segala, a member of the research team, said this:
Over the past 5 years, it has been our experience that when people interact with the phenomena and do not treat it with respect, that's when we see a higher rate of the hitchhiker syndrome. Symptoms experienced by people range from acute neurological injuries to chronic blood disease. Those who have told us they brought home a souvenir often experience illness, as do their family members. The data comes from years of tracking and collected reports from those who have come forward.
And yet the Hitchhiker Effect is not unique to Skinwalker Ranch. The AWSAP team found similar effects linked to certain UFO sightings, for example. People would encounter phenomena and then experience ongoing disturbances in their home. I mentioned the author Darren Ritson earlier, who refers to this phenomenon as the paranormal contagion effect. He talks about it in relation to poltergeists. Ritson investigated a shocking poltergeist case in South Shields in the UK in 2006, and along with co-researcher Michael Hallowell, both men found themselves bringing a paranormal effect back home with them. Things that included, and I quote,
windows opening and shutting repeatedly, appearances of anomalous black shapes, sounds of footsteps in the loft, banging and thumping noises in the bedrooms, people being pushed violently from behind, discarnate voices, objects being moved around.
Ritson likened the poltergeist activity to a communicable disease, and his observations are eerily similar to the dynamics of Skinwalker Ranch. The idea that paranormal activity can behave like an infection spreading from person to person is a mind-bending concept. Colm Kelleher speculated that it might be tied to human consciousness. Perhaps encountering the paranormal alters one's awareness, opening a person's perception to previously unseen realms. It's as though experiencing the paranormal tunes the mind to a new frequency, revealing signals that were always present but simply imperceptible before. It's like when a radio dials into a certain frequency and picks up the invisible signals that were there all along, just previously not received. Does an encounter in a haunted location dial us into a frequency that somehow makes us more aware of the strange entities that live around us all the time? In other words, does exposure to the paranormal grant an increased ability to perceive hidden dimensions? The unsettling implication, of course, is that we may already be surrounded by inexplicable things invisible to us. Exactly what is happening with the Hitchhiker Effect remains unknown, but Skinwalker Ranch continues to raise profound and troubling questions, including for me, because weirdly enough, when I was looking into this, I and a few others may have experienced the Hitchhiker Effect for ourselves. I first began to look into the Hitchhiker Effect in detail back in May 2023. And to help me understand the work of Skinwalker Ranch, I joined the Skinwalker Ranch Insider program. This granted me access to records, the research team, and 24/7 live webcams of the ranch. And when I first joined, I often had those live cams playing, sometimes just as background noise while I was writing or working. I'm always listening to music and ambient sounds in the background when I read, work, cook, sleep. All the time, I suppose. Well, after monitoring the Skinwalker Ranch live camera feed for a while, I got used to the sounds of that feed, and so I would leave them running all day while I worked. And occasionally I even fell asleep with the cams running beside my bed on my Amazon Echo Show. So I'd wake up in the middle of the night and they would be playing away. I found the ambient noise of the ranch soothing because, I have a little bit of tinnitus, constant ringing in one of my ears, and the ambient sound helps ease that. Well, everything was fine until I noticed something strange happening with our Wi-Fi. We have both 5G and two 4G networks at home, but after spending hours watching the Skinwalker Ranch cams, the 2.4G network suddenly just stopped entirely. Puzzled, I contacted my internet provider and spent an hour on the phone troubleshooting with them. The representative was baffled and eventually sent out a brand new, much faster router. I thought this would solve the issue, but when I set it up, the problem got even worse. Even the 5G network was sluggish, despite the strong signal strength and excellent speed test results. After another hour on the phone with the technician, he admitted, I've got to be honest, I have never seen a tech issue like this before. I am completely confused why this is happening. Frustrated, I couldn't help but think about the book Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, which we've been discussing tonight, and all of these cams that I was just playing while I was doing all of my work and reading and stuff like that. So I decided to try something. It felt a bit silly, but I reconnected the old router and stopped watching the Skinwalker Ranch cam feed. And guess what? Once I stopped watching that, both the 5G and the 2.4G networks came back online perfectly. And since then, the internet has been working flawlessly. Now, you may well say, the reason your internet struggled was because you had a live cam running and it was draining the system. That's possibly true. But what happened next was even stranger. You see, once I'd researched the Skinwalker Effect, I talked about it all, everything I've mentioned tonight, in an audio podcast, and that came out in 2 parts. And I had the Skinwalker Ranch cams playing throughout my prep for that and in the recording. This was before I switched them off. Well, I thought that was that. But then I started getting messages from listeners, some of whom I didn't really know, others I did. They said they listened to my episode on the Hitchhiker Effect, but then they had strange things happen in their home. Again, could be just a coincidence, but just listen to these. These are honestly things I received. I'm not making any of this up. The emails are gone. And I don't get these sorts of emails related to any other episode. One was a fellow podcaster called Tracy Nichols. She hosts the Folkloring podcast, and she emailed me saying,
Dude, I listened to part 2 of Skinwalker Ranch yesterday. Shortly after, I was conducting an interview for the podcast, and the chaos that ensued on that interview was like nothing I have ever seen.
She said the sound kept cutting out. A weird echo of voices was heard, and the neighbor's generator went off, but it was pounding loudly in their house. None of these things had happened before. And she said, half jokingly,
Can you put a trigger warning on any future episodes that might mess with my reality?
Well, I kind of found that sort of fun, a little bit weird, but, just a funny coincidence. But then I got a message from another listener who had listened to that episode. She said that after she and her partner listened to it, her partner went downstairs to grab his shoes to go running. I'm not making this up. She said the laces of his shoes had been tied together. She was perplexed by this and assumed it was just a weird coincidence, but she did say that she checked and they weren't just tangled. The laces were completely tied to one another. They don't have kids. They just looked at each other going, how the heck did this happen? As well as this, another listener got in touch to say that while she was listening to the episode, her young son was in the room. And he suddenly started looking out of the window into the garden as if he was catching the eye of someone out there. And he started walking up and down as if the thing was walking with him. Again, kids do that, I suppose. But she had this feeling, could it be related? Another woman got in touch to say that she had heard people talking about my episode causing strange things to happen, and she thought it was all a load of rubbish. Fair enough. Then she listened to it, and she emailed the next day in a bit of shock. You see, she listened to it on the night, and then she woke up the next day and she felt very ill. In fact, she couldn't get out of bed because she said she'd been struck with a kind of vertigo where the room was spinning and she had to spend days in bed to recover. Now, were these strange incidents and my odd Wi-Fi issues caused by Skinwalker Ranch? Well, look, I get it. The idea does sound utterly ridiculous. And fair enough if you roll your eyes at the idea. I'm not saying it's definite at all. But, this sort of idea might come to mind if you do consider the theory we're talking about here tonight. What if there are times when the paranormal does not only remain in the so-called haunted location, but it spills out, like a paranormal tsunami across the world, that it can affect other places, be that nearby, like houses next door, for example. Check out my video on the Sucky Poltergeists. It's a great example of that, where a weird, crazy, well-attested poltergeist happens in one house, and then it starts happening in the house next door. But in the cases we've explored tonight, these things have crossed way more than just houses next door. We're talking about miles and miles of distance. The claim is even that such things could even be sparked just by talking about them, like in that Washington, D.C. meeting. Who knows? But if anything unusual happens after you've listened to this, let me know. But as well as that, perhaps you could share your theories on the idea of the Hitchhiker Effect and paranormal contagion. Does it make sense to you? Is it stupid? Or do you think there might be something to this? But until next time, I guess you might want to remember the words of the famous Haunted Mansion ride in Disney. When I went there to Disney World, I made a beeline to get on that ride. And it's not particularly that scary. It's more fun and just cute and atmospheric and great. but you do get the tiny chill when you get off and you think of the concept, the idea that it says a ghost might follow you home. I wonder if that actually happens in real life. I'm Peter Laws, and you've been listening to The Wolves That Follow You Home, The Hitchhiker Effect at Skinwalker Ranch. Good night. If you like these videos and you want to get more involved, perhaps you want to check out patreon.com/Peter Laws. You can get a lot of extra content from me there, but also it's a way of supporting the show, and it enables me to keep making these videos. So that's patreon.com/Peter Laws, but I'll still be here on YouTube. So I will see you in the next one.